was around the first stop of my cross-country vacation when I first started noticing something was off, and it only got worse from there. My name is Olivia Bennett. A few years ago, in late October, I decided to take 3 weeks off from my corporate job in Pennsylvania and drive my SUV all the way out to Utah. I had never done a solo road trip of that scale before. I just wanted to see the country, visit a few national parks, and get away from the stress of my daily life for a while. I had a very loose route planned out, mostly sticking to the major interstates. I deliberately didn't book all my hotels in advance. I wanted the flexibility to stop driving whenever I got tired. My plan was to just pull over in the late afternoon, find a standard chain hotel on my phone, and book a room for the night. The first day of driving was mostly uneventful, just hours of highway stretching out in front of me. My first major stop for the night was just outside of Columbus, Ohio. It had been raining heavily for the last 4 hours of the drive. The rhythmic sound of the windshield wipers had nearly put me to sleep, and by the time I pulled into the brightly lit hotel parking lot around 9 p.m., I was completely exhausted. I grabbed my overnight duffel bag from the trunk and went inside to the front desk. The lobby was empty except for the employee working behind the counter. I gave the man my driver's license and credit card. He typed on his keyboard for a minute, swiped a blank key card to his machine, and then frowned at his monitor. He tried swiping the card again, looking genuinely confused. He looked up at me and apologized, saying the computer system was acting up. He told me the screen showed my room key had already been activated about 15 minutes ago. He assumed it was just a network delay or a glitch from when I booked the reservation online a few hours earlier. He manually overrode the system, handed me the card, and pointed me toward the elevators. I didn't think anything of it. My room was at the very end of the second-floor hallway. The carpet absorbed the sound of my footsteps as I walked. When I opened the door to room 114, the room was dark, but I immediately noticed the television was on. It was muted, just playing a local weather channel. The curtains were drawn tightly shut, blocking out the light from the parking lot. I set my bag down on the luggage rack and walked further inside. I noticed the small coffee maker sitting on the desk near the window. One of those small plastic coffee pods was already inserted inside the machine. When I pressed my bare hand against the side of the plastic water reservoir, the plastic was noticeably warm to the touch. I figured housekeeping had just rushed through the room earlier in the day, or maybe a previous guest had checked out late and the staff had missed a few minor things while cleaning. It was a little strange, but I was simply too tired to care. I engaged the heavy metal deadbolt, fastened the metal swing latch at the top of the door frame, and went to sleep. The next day involved a massive, grueling stretch of driving. I crossed through Indiana and Illinois, watching the landscape flatten out around me. I finally stopped in Columbia, Missouri, pulling into a hotel parking lot just before 11 p.m. I booked a different hotel brand this time, hoping for a slightly better bed and a quieter floor. I walked into the lobby and gave my name to the woman standing behind the counter. She pulled up my reservation, but just like the guy in Ohio, she got a very confused look on her face. She looked at me, then looked back at her glowing screen. She leaned forward and asked if my husband or a travel partner had arrived at the hotel before me. I told her I was traveling completely alone. My stomach dropped when she told me the system logged a physical check-in for my room just 10 minutes before I walked through the sliding glass doors. I asked her how that was even possible. She blamed a central system error, saying the main booking software sometimes misreads check-in times across different time zones. It sounded plausible enough, but I still felt uneasy about the coincidence. She canceled the previous digital key in her system and handed me a newly programmed one. My room was on the 3rd floor, right near the stairwell. I swiped the card, watched the small light turn green, and pushed the heavy door open. As soon as I walked in, something felt off. The air in the room felt heavy and uncomfortably warm, like the heater had been running on high. The bed was perfectly made, but when I walked into the bathroom, the small woven basket of complimentary toiletries on the counter was knocked over. The little bottles of shampoo, conditioner, and soap were scattered across the fake marble counter. Next to them was a white hand towel. It was crumpled into a ball. When I reached out and touched it, the fabric was damp. I immediately called down to the front desk and asked if anyone had been in the room. The woman assured me nobody else had been issued a key and that housekeeping had finished cleaning that specific floor hours ago. I checked the closets, pulled back the shower curtain, and looked under the bed. The room was entirely empty. I locked the deadbolt and shoved a heavy upholstered armchair tightly under the door handle. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to a soft clicking noise in the dark. It was coming from the door. It was the distinct sound of a plastic card sliding into the electronic reader. Then, I heard the heavy metal handle slowly push down. The door pressed hard against the deadbolt and the fabric of the armchair. I sat up in bed, completely frozen, clutching the blankets. I waited for a loud knock, or for someone to announce they were hotel staff, but there was just silence. A minute later, I heard the faint sound of heavy footsteps walking away down the carpeted hallway. I stayed awake until the sun came up. I left early the next morning and drove straight through the flat plains of Kansas, pushing myself to reach Colorado before nightfall. The drive felt endless. There were long stretches where I didn't see another car for miles, just endless fields of dry grass and towering wind turbines. I kept constantly checking my rearview mirror, wondering if someone was somehow following me on the highway. But that didn't make any logical sense. How would they know where I was going if I was booking these rooms from my phone at the very last minute? By the time I finally reached Denver, it was getting dark. I decided to pull off the interstate and book a room at a large, busy hotel right in the downtown area. I figured having more people around and more security cameras would mean I was safer. I walked into the bustling lobby and went straight to the front desk. The manager was working the evening shift. I handed him my ID and credit card. He pulled up my reservation, started to program a keycard, and then suddenly stopped. His face went pale. He didn't casually say it was a computer glitch this time. He turned his large monitor slightly so I could see the screen. Under my room number, there was a detailed log of electronic access. The screen showed dozens of individual entries. Someone had been swiping a keycard at my assigned room door every 10 to 15 minutes for the last 2 hours straight. I felt sick. I asked him who was doing it. He shook his head and said the system only records that a card assigned to my room was used, not who was holding it. He immediately canceled the active key in the system. He quietly handed me a second, newly programmed key and told me he was moving me to a completely different floor at the opposite end of the building. He promised to send a security guard to check the hallways immediately. I took the new key and rode the elevator up to the 7th floor. I got inside the new room, locked every single lock, fastened the chain, and pushed the heavy wooden desk directly against the door. I didn't turn on the television. I didn't unpack my duffel bag. I just sat on the edge of the mattress in the dark, listening to the low hum of the mini fridge. For a few hours, nothing happened. Then, at exactly 1:15 a.m., I heard it again. A short, low beep came from the electronic lock on my door. A solid red light reflected through the gap under the door frame, illuminating the carpet. Someone was trying to swipe a card. The lock rejected it, just like the manager promised it would. A few seconds later, they swiped it again. Then again. It wasn't frantic or aggressive. It was a slow, methodical swiping. They were just standing there in the hallway, sliding the card in and out, waiting patiently for the green light to appear. I didn't move an inch. I watched the dark shadow of a pair of shoes visible in the thin strip of light under the door. After the 4th swipe, the handle slowly turned, stopping hard against the locked mechanism. Then, the person shifted their weight. I could hear a faint, shallow breathing right on the other side of the wood. They stood there in absolute silence for almost 20 minutes, before I finally heard the slow sound of their shoes walking away toward the stairwell. The next morning, I packed my bag and took the elevator straight down to the lobby to check out. I wanted to leave the hotel, cancel the rest of my vacation, and drive straight back home. I walked up to the front desk and reached into my heavy winter coat pocket to hand over my keycards. I pulled them out and placed them on the smooth wooden counter. But there weren't just 2 cards sitting there, there were 3. I looked at them, completely confused. The clerk took all 3 cards and scanned them against his computer reader to clear them from the active system. He looked up at me with a strange expression and handed one of the cards back. He told me the 2 cards issued by the hotel were already deactivated and their magnetic strips were completely wiped. But the 3rd card, the one he was holding out to me, was still fully active. It was a blank white card with no hotel logo on it. The clerk looked at the screen again and told me that a specific card wasn't issued to me. In fact, it wasn't issued by their hotel at all. It was a master key from a different hotel chain entirely, programmed with my name embedded in the internal digital data. I had never been given that card, and my winter coat had been hanging in the closet inside my locked room all night. Would you have called the police or just kept driving? When I first arrived at the rental car lot in Portland, I didn't think anything of it. But looking back, that was my first mistake. My name is Alex Morrison. A couple of years ago, during the early fall, I decided to take a 10-day solo road trip up the West Coast. I had never spent much time in the Pacific Northwest, and I wanted to drive from Oregon up through Washington, stopping at various hiking trails and coastal towns along the way. I flew into the airport, picked up my luggage, and took the shuttle bus over to a major rental car agency just outside the city limits. The lot was massive, filled with rows of identical vehicles. The agent at the front desk handed me a single electronic key fob and pointed me toward Section 4. I found my assigned car sitting under the concrete overhang of the parking structure. It was a standard, late-model silver sedan. It was completely generic, the kind of vehicle that blends into highway traffic without a second glance. I did a quick walk around the exterior to check for any existing dents or scratches, threw my heavy canvas backpack and duffel bag into the trunk, and pulled out onto the road. I spent the entire first day driving around the outskirts of the city, familiarizing myself with the area. By the time evening rolled around, I was exhausted. I didn't have a strict itinerary, so I just pulled off the highway and found a standard 2-story motel. It was an older building with exterior hallways, where the parking spaces were located right outside the room doors. I checked in at the front desk and was given room 114 on the ground floor. I pulled the silver sedan into the parking space directly in front of my room's large front window. I specifically remember putting the car in park, turning off the headlights, and grabbing my bags from the back. I pressed the lock button on the key fob twice. I heard the horn give a short, sharp beep, confirming the doors were secured. I went inside, locked the deadbolt, and went straight to sleep. The next morning, I woke up around 7 a.m. I got dressed, grabbed my bags, and walked out the front door, ready to hit the road. When I stepped onto the concrete walkway, I stopped in my tracks. The parking space directly in front of my room was empty. For a brief second, a strong feeling of panic washed over me. For a Beckhutti, I thought the car had been stolen. But when I looked to my left, I saw the silver sedan sitting there. It was parked 4 spaces down from my room, angled slightly over the faded white line. I just stood there staring at it, holding my bags. I could have sworn I parked right in front of my window. I remembered looking directly at the hood of the car before I closed the curtains. I walked over to the vehicle and pressed the unlock button on my fob. The headlights flashed and the locks disengaged with a loud click. I opened the driver's side door and looked inside. Everything was exactly as I had left it. My phone charging cable was still resting on the center console. A half-empty bottle of water was still sitting in the cup holder. I checked the trunk, and the spare tire compartment was undisturbed. I convinced myself I was just tired the night before. I had been driving all day, navigating unfamiliar roads, and I must have simply misremembered which spot I pulled into. I brushed it off, started the engine, and merged back onto the highway, heading north toward Washington. I drove for several hours, crossing the state border and eventually making my way into Tacoma. I spent the afternoon exploring the downtown area before deciding to find a place to stay for the night. Since the previous night's parking situation had left me feeling slightly uneasy, I decided to book a room at a much nicer, modern hotel. This one had a massive, well-lit parking lot surrounding the building, with several security cameras visible on the exterior walls. I pulled into the lot just after 9 p.m. This time, I was deliberately cautious about where I parked. I found a space directly underneath a bright halogen street lamp, right next to a concrete median. I took a mental note of the exact spot. I locked the car, listened for the horn to beep, and walked into the lobby. When I got to my room on the 4th floor, I placed the rental car key fob on the wooden nightstand, right next to my wallet and my room key. I made sure the door was securely locked, fastened the metal latch, and went to bed. I woke up the following morning at 6:30 a.m. I walked over to the window, pulled back the heavy curtains, and looked down at the parking lot. The space underneath the bright halogen street lamp was completely empty. My stomach dropped. I threw on my clothes, grabbed my keys from the nightstand, and rushed down to the lobby. I walked out the sliding glass doors and went straight to the spot where I had parked. There was no glass on the ground. There were no signs of a break-in. The car was just gone. I started walking the perimeter of the large hotel building, hitting the unlock button on my fob repeatedly, hoping to hear the horn chirp. As I rounded the back corner of the hotel, near the large metal dumpsters in the employee entrance, the headlights of a car flashed in the distance. I walked toward it. It was my silver rental sedan. It was parked perfectly between two white lines in the furthest corner of the back lot, completely hidden from the main road. I approached the driver's side door and looked through the window. The doors were still locked. I pulled the handle just to be sure and it wouldn't open. I pressed the button on my fob, unlocked it, and sat in the driver's seat. Nothing had been stolen. The interior looked completely normal. But as soon as I sat down, I realized something was wrong. I am not a very tall person and I keep my seat pulled relatively close to the steering wheel. But now, my feet could barely touch the pedals. The seat had been pushed back several inches. I also noticed the rearview mirror was angled slightly upward. Someone else had been sitting in the driver's seat. I immediately grabbed my phone and called the rental car agency's customer service line. I explained the entire situation to the representative on the phone. I asked her if it was possible that another customer had somehow been given a duplicate key fob for my exact vehicle. She put me on a brief hold. When she came back on the line, her tone had completely changed. She sounded confused, almost concerned. She told me their system confirmed there was only one active key fob for that specific car, and it was the one currently in my possession. However, she told me she had just pulled up the internal GPS tracking data for the vehicle. Every car in their fleet was equipped with a tracker for recovery purposes. She read the logs out loud to me. According to the company's GPS data, the engine of my rental car had been started at 2:15 a.m. The vehicle had then been driven for almost 30 miles, making several stops around the downtown Tacoma area. The engine was finally turned off and parked behind the hotel at 4:30 a.m. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. I told the representative I had been asleep in my locked hotel room on the 4th floor the entire night. The only key fob to the car had been sitting on the nightstand right next to my head. She didn't have an explanation. She just apologized profusely and offered to have a tow truck bring a replacement vehicle to my location. I told her I would just return the car early and find other transportation. I hung up the phone and sat in the quiet car, staring at the dashboard. Someone was accessing the vehicle while I slept. They were taking it, driving it around for hours in the middle of the night, and bringing it back before the sun came up. And they were doing it without setting off the alarm, without forcing the ignition, and without leaving any visible trace. I started tearing the car apart. I checked under the heavy rubber floor mats. I opened the glove box and sifted through the rental manuals. I checked the pockets behind the front seats. Finally, I wedged my hand deep into the tight, dark gap between the passenger seat and the plastic center console. My fingers brushed against a piece of crumpled paper. I pulled it out and smoothed it out over the steering wheel. It was a small, square parking garage receipt. It was from a municipal parking structure located in the center of downtown Tacoma. I looked down at the timestamp, printed in faded purple ink at the bottom of the paper. It was marked for 2:45 a.m. Someone had been sitting exactly where I was sitting, paying for parking in the middle of the night, while I was supposedly alone and safe in my hotel room. I didn't even bother going back to my room to pack slowly. I rushed upstairs, shoved all my clothes into my duffel bag and my canvas backpack, and checked out immediately. I drove the car straight up Interstate 5 to the Seattle airport and returned it to the agency 3 days early. I didn't care about getting a refund. I just handed the keys to the attendant, grabbed my bags from the trunk, and walked away. I spent the last few days of my trip using rideshare apps and staying in a highly secure hotel in downtown Seattle, constantly looking over my shoulder. Eventually, my trip ended, and I flew back home to the East Coast. I tried to put the entire bizarre experience behind me. I assumed someone had simply managed to clone the electronic signal of the key fob and was using the car for some sort of late-night activity. It was terrifying, but I was thousands of miles away now. Weeks later, I was in my apartment getting ready for a weekend camping trip with some friends. I went to my closet and pulled out the same heavy canvas backpack I had used during my West Coast trip. I unzipped the main compartment and started cleaning out the smaller pockets, throwing away old boarding passes and loose change. I unzipped the small, hidden pocket on the very inside of the bag. I reached my fingers down into the very bottom corner and felt a small, folded piece of paper. I pulled it out and flattened it against my kitchen counter. It was another square receipt, printed in the exact same faded purple ink. It was from the exact same municipal parking garage in downtown Tacoma. The timestamp at the bottom read 3:15 a.m. That backpack hadn't been left in the rental car. It had been sitting on the floor inside my locked hotel room the entire night. What would you do if you found that second receipt in your bag? I didn't realize anything was wrong during my solo road trip until it was already too late. My name is Megan Foster. Last spring, I decided to take a 10-day drive through the Blue Ridge Mountains in North Carolina. I live in a heavily populated area of Virginia, and I just needed a break from the constant traffic and the noise of the city. I didn't have a strict itinerary for the trip. I just packed my SUV, booked a few small independent motels along the route, and planned to spend my days hiking different trails and taking landscape photographs. Photography is a serious hobby of mine, so I brought my main digital DSLR camera. It's a large, heavy piece of equipment, not something you can just slip into a jacket pocket or casually carry without noticing. It has a long mechanical lens and a thick, woven canvas neck strap. When I wasn't actively taking pictures outside, I usually just kept it resting on the passenger seat of my car, or tucked deeply inside my large leather tote bag. The trip itself felt completely normal. I drove through winding mountain roads, stopped at various scenic overlooks, and took hundreds of photos of the trees and the morning fog. I felt perfectly safe the entire time. I finally got back to my apartment in Virginia late on a Sunday evening. I had driven for almost 8 hours straight, and I was entirely exhausted. I carried my luggage up the 2 flights of stairs, dropped my bags on the living room rug, and went straight to sleep. The next morning, I woke up early. The apartment was completely quiet, with only the low hum of the refrigerator running in the kitchen. I decided to get my unpacking done right away. I opened my large, hard-shell suitcase on the floor and took every single item out. I tossed my dirty clothes into the laundry basket, folded the clean shirts, and put them in my wooden dresser. Once it was completely empty, I zipped the large suitcase shut and shoved it into the very back of my hall closet. After making a cup of coffee, I sat down at my small desk in the living room to sort through my pictures. I pulled the small plastic SD card out of the side of my camera, slid it into the port on my laptop, and opened the main image folder on my screen. The first 100 photos were exactly what I remembered taking. There were wide shots of the mountains, a few waterfalls, and miles of empty highway stretching out of my car. I was rapidly tapping the right arrow key on my keyboard, barely looking at the screen as the files cycled past. But as I clicked into the middle of the trip's folder, something felt off. The image on my monitor wasn't a mountain or a trail. It was a photo of a cracked concrete parking lot at a roadside rest stop. It was taken from a very low angle, just showing an empty parking space, a faded yellow painted line, and the bottom half of a rusted metal trash can. I looked at the digital timestamp in the bottom corner of the file. It read Tuesday, 2:30 p.m. I remembered that specific rest stop. I had pulled over to stretch my legs and use the restroom around that time on my second day of driving. But I definitely didn't take a picture of the dirty pavement. I stared at the screen for a minute, trying to figure out why I would have taken it. I eventually just convinced myself that the heavy camera must have bumped against my hip while it was hanging around my neck, accidentally triggering the shutter button. I deleted the strange, blurry photo and kept scrolling through the folder. I clicked through another 50 pictures of the scenery. Then, I stopped again. This photo was taken at night. It was a shot of a small, glowing diner window taken from the dark parking lot outside. I immediately recognized the bright red neon sign hanging in the glass. I had eaten dinner at that exact place on Thursday evening. It was pouring rain that night, so I had parked near the back of the lot and run inside to get out of the weather. I leaned closer to the monitor, looking at the center of the image. Through the rain-streaked glass of the diner window, I could clearly see a woman sitting alone in a booth, looking down at a menu. It was me. My stomach dropped. The photo was taken from outside the building, maybe 30 feet away, by someone standing in the dark parking lot. But my camera was supposed to be locked inside my SUV. When I ran into the diner that night, I had zipped the camera inside my leather tote bag and left it sitting on the passenger seat. I specifically remembered locking the car doors as I walked away, because all my luggage was sitting in the back seat. Someone had been standing in the freezing rain, holding my personal camera, taking a picture of me while I was inside eating. I felt a cold sweat form on the back of my neck. I started pressing the arrow key much faster, watching the file dates and timestamps jump forward. Most of the photos were my normal hiking shots, perfectly in focus and framed by me. But hidden between them were more pictures that I absolutely didn't take. There was a blurry shot of my car's rear license plate taken from behind. There was a picture of a gas station pump, taken from a few feet away while my back was turned toward the register. I kept clicking until I reached the photos from Saturday. It was my last full day on the road. I had booked a room at a small, single-story motel just outside of Asheville. The room doors faced directly out into the open parking lot. The next image on my motel room, it was taken from the far corner of the room, right near the bathroom door, pointing directly at the neatly made bed. I checked the timestamp on the file. It read 1:15 p.m. I remembered that afternoon perfectly. I had been hiking a steep, rocky trail almost 3 miles away from the motel. I had deliberately left my camera behind that day because the sky looked extremely dark and I didn't want the lens to get wet. Before I left, I had zipped the camera deep inside my canvas duffel bag, shoved it under the wooden desk, and firmly locked the heavy motel room door. Someone had been inside my room while I was miles away in the woods. They hadn't stolen my laptop or my money. They had simply unzipped my bag, taken my camera out, and taken a picture of the empty bed. The silence in my apartment suddenly felt suffocating. I didn't want to look at the rest of the files, but my hand was shaking as I pressed the arrow key again. The next 4 photos were pitch black. At first, I thought the files were simply corrupted. They were just empty, dark frames with heavy digital static. But the timestamps at the bottom of the screen were perfectly clear and sequential. 3:30 a.m., 3:45 a.m., 4 a.m., 4:15 a.m. They weren't corrupted files. The room was just completely dark when they were taken. I had been asleep in that bed. My camera had been sitting on the wooden nightstand right next to my head. Whoever took those photos was standing right next to the mattress, pointing the lens down in the dark, pressing the shutter button over and over again while I was sleeping. I felt completely sick. I only had 1 photo left in the entire folder. My finger hovered over the keyboard for a long time before I finally pressed the button. The final photo was taken on Sunday morning, right before I checked out of the motel. The room was bright, lit by the morning sun coming through the thin window curtains. The image was perfectly in focus. It showed my large, hard-shell suitcase sitting open on the metal luggage rack near the door. It was completely packed. All my jeans, shirts, and sweaters were neatly folded inside, ready to be zipped up for the long drive home. But right in the center of the suitcase, tucked underneath the edge of a thick gray wool sweater, there was a small, heavy-looking black object. It looked like a thick plastic casing with a small, glowing red light on the side. The fabric of the sweater was pulled back just enough to expose it for the picture. I froze, staring at the screen. I had completely unpacked that exact same suitcase just 2 hours ago in my own bedroom. I had taken every single shirt, pair of jeans, and sweater out and put them in my wooden dresser. I had folded the empty suitcase and shoved it into the back of my hall closet. But I never found a black object. I had touched every single piece of clothing. I had emptied every fabric pocket. I had shaken out the clothes before putting them away. The suitcase was completely empty when I pushed it into the closet. Whatever was sitting under that sweater in the photo was gone. What do you think was hidden in the suitcase?